November was an okay reading month for me. As we get into January and I start to make the content, you know, like reflecting back on 2025 as a whole, you're going to see that over the course of this year, I just generally haven't read as much as I have in previous years. Like every month, I've read a little bit less than is typical for me, which is absolutely fine. It's just interesting. I do think one of the contributing factors to this is that I have been DNFing a lot more books recently, but I read a total of 7 books in November. Some of them were a little bit chunkier. I read a couple of epic fantasies, which was great. And we're going to be talking about all of my thoughts in this video. Straight into the stats, like I said, in the month of November, I read 7 books, which added up to a total of 3,104 pages that broke down to an average of 103 pages per day. For the star ratings, it was pretty decent. I had 3 3-star reads and 4 4-star, breaking down to an average of 3.6 stars per book. For the demographics, I read 1 young adult book and 6 adult. For the formats, we had 4 standardly formatted novels, 2 ebooks and 1 ARC. For the genre, we kept it pretty simple. We had 4 fantasy books, 2 fantasy romance and 1 mystery. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 4 of them were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2025. 2 of them were books I've been sent by the publisher, and 1 is a book that I've hauled this year. So getting into my thoughts, we are unfortunately going to be starting off with a little bit of a disappointing one, because the first book that I finished in November was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. So this one was my Halloween read. I'd already read quite a lot of like horror and thriller books in October, so I wanted something that had like the witchy vibes but was a little bit on the cuter side, and this definitely delivered that. Although I felt in terms of it being a more cozy story dealing with a lot of heartwarming themes and topics, I don't really feel like it did much for me on the emotional front, which is really what I wanted from a book like this. But this is following a witch called Mika, and she is part of a society of witches. Now, to keep witches safe, they live very separate lives from each other. They can't really socialize, they can't live together because this will draw attention to them, which means that they are more likely to have their magic revealed. So Mika grew up with a woman who really believed in this ethos, so she adopted her because all witches' parents die, like the majority of witches are orphans. And so this woman adopted her, but she was a very absent parent, and Mika grew up feeling very lonely and very lost. So one day she's contacted by this guy who has seen the YouTube videos that she makes where she leans into the witchy aesthetic, and he's like, I think you're a real witch, not just somebody pretending to be one. And we have these 3 magical children who need help with their witchcraft. We are doing our best in terms of their education, in terms of their emotional needs, but none of us are witches, and they need somebody who's going to train them in witchcraft before something really dangerous happens. So she goes to this house and kind of finds 3 children that are growing up in a similar situation to her, where they have the support system, but the witch that's actually adopted them has also abandoned them and isn't around very often. And so she, seeing like her own childhood in front of her, steps in to help these children learn about their witchcraft so they have a like positive guiding figure in their life that she lacked. I want to say it's mainly a cozy fantasy. It's actually mainly a romance, and I think that that is where this let me down. I went into this wanting those cozy fantasy vibes for like literally once in my life, because I'm not much of a cozy reader, and I wanted to really immerse myself in the heartwarming atmosphere of this woman taking these 3 children under her wing and training them and helping them to avoid all of the things that kind of went wrong in her life, in her childhood, that she still thinks about. But actually there is one man who lives on this property that our main character finds herself drawn to, and considering this is quite a short book, I feel like the majority of it was dedicated towards their relationship with the children and the rest of the supporting cast who become like a found family, mainly just filling in the background here, which I thought was quite unfortunate. And in terms of the way that it deals with the topics that are present in here, with the kind of like abandonment that all of these children are feeling, and also the lack of positive role models, I really wish that we'd have delved into that a little bit more in a way that produced some sort of emotion from me. But overall, this kind of fell really flat. I think that given the size of the book as well, it attempted to do too much with the romantic plotline and the other stuff going on. I feel like it should have just really focused on one of them and had that be the core of the novel, or it should have been a little bit longer and fully fleshed out all of these elements in a way that made them all feel a little bit more well done than I thought that they were. I gave it like a 3-star. It was fine, it was enjoyable, but it didn't really do anything for me. I then read A Time of Blood by John Gwynne, which was our catch-up book club book for the months of, let me think, what a month, September and October, I think. This one is the second book in the Of Blood and Bone series, which is a spin-off from The Faithful and the Fallen. This is like an adult epic fantasy series. There are 2 series set in the same world, which is the Banished Lands. The Faithful and the Fallen is the core series, and then this one takes place around 100 to 150 years after the events of The Faithful and the Fallen. Now, it is hard to discuss this one without spoiling the end of The Faithful and the Fallen, but essentially The Faithful and the Fallen is about regular people in a regular world that's based on like early British mythology. They start to learn that the magical creatures, the creatures of mythology and legend, are real. So as you progress through that series, it gets more and more fantastical, and it kind of culminates in a way where all of these mythological creatures are now kind of a regular part of life because of how the fantastical elements build throughout the first series. So in A Time of Blood, there is one particular species that the citizens of this world are trying to adjust to, but the way that they have decided to assimilate with this society is in a way that honestly very closely represents colonialism. They are stripping the people around them of their cultures and bringing them into the fold in the name of a greater good. But this series really deals with the themes of good and evil in a way where it shows you how the good side is not necessarily much better than the evil side, even though they are supposed to be very opposite sides of this eternal kind of struggle that we have going on. So this is a multi-perspective series. We have had 4 perspectives in each of the 2 books so far, and I'm expecting there to also be 4, maybe 5 in book 3, which I'm going to be reading in January. And I do really enjoy this series for a different reason than I enjoyed The Faithful and the Fallen. So something that I think that this series lacks a little bit for me is characters that I can really root for, because the perspectives that we have in here, a lot of them are interesting, but they're not really resonating with me once again on an emotional level, whereas the characters in The Faithful and the Fallen, some of them were ride or die for me. Maquin, Varadis, oh my guys, like I was rooting for them in The Faithful and the Fallen. And there is a perspective in here. The perspective of Drem is my favorite and has been my favorite throughout the series so far, but we have a couple of other perspectives, which are Riv and Bleda, that very much deal with the politics of this world, which I find very interesting. But in terms of them being characters, being people, like I'm not finding that I'm as attached to them as I was in The Faithful and the Fallen. And part of that could be because these books are significantly shorter. This is also a trilogy as opposed to a 4-book series, but I do think that this is a stronger series plot-wise because it is smaller, because it's more concise. I do wonder how we're going to leave this series, because I think that the problem that we're trying to deal with is a little bit too vast for it to be able to wrap up in one more book, which is a little bit longer. I think it's like 600 to 700 pages as opposed to like 450 to 500 pages of the first 2 books. But I also really like that John Gwynne deals with some darker topics in this one. There's topics of like sexual abuse, grooming, abuse of power. There's also a kind of like Van Helsing horror element that's really prevalent in book 1, but the results of that kind of horror atmosphere are still present in here, and they do get more horrific in a different way in book 2, whereas The Faithful and the Fallen, for all intents and purposes, is a very kind of like classic reading fantasy. This deals with some more interesting themes that I don't typically see in a classical high fantasy, epic fantasy world. And on top of the way that it tackles the themes of good and evil in a less black and white manner, means that this is one that I'm really enjoying. I just wish we had more time with the characters so that I could form more of an attachment to them. But I gave this one 4 stars. Still love this series. I'm very excited to continue on after Blood and Bone with the Bloodsworn Saga, which if you've missed it, I did post an announcement that we are going to be adding that on to the end of this round of catch-up book club. A book that has been on my shelves for years and it had gotten to the point where I thought that I wasn't going to enjoy it anymore is The Smug Thieves by Sally Green. However, I was very pleasantly surprised by this one and I ended up giving it 4 stars. I had a really good time. So this is a young adult multi-perspective fantasy, and I have read a different series. I've read the Half Bad series by Sally Green. I think it's Half Bad, and that was many years ago. Like that predates me being on BookTube. So when Sally Green announced way back in like 2017, 2018, a multi-perspective high fantasy series, I was all for it. However, many years have passed and I have not read this. So I went into it with a great deal of trepidation and I actually had a really good time. This one deals with 5 4 central characters. Okay, I couldn't for the life of me think who the 5th one is, but I've got it now. So this follows 5 central characters, and it is set in this world where there is a drug called demon smoke. So there are people who kill demons, they capture the smoke, they sell it for a great deal of money, and people ingest it as a drug. Now, this is something that isn't super common, like it goes on in the shadows, but a lot of people in this world just live their lives without ever interacting with demons. They're not like a main part of the society. Now, 3 of our characters are more heavily tied to the demon smoke side of this world. We have Tash, who is somebody who works for a demon hunter with the sole purpose of extracting the smoke. She's quite young. She's like in her middle teenage years. We also have the bastard son of a prince who steals the demon smoke from Tash. She has this like compulsion to steal, so she ends up chasing him to get it back. We also have this guy from a country that has pretty much had its culture eradicated by this bigger society that has kind of, once again, like with the Faithful and the Fallen and of Blood and Bone, has taken his country into theirs and is like erasing their culture. And he actually works for the prince that the other guy is the bastard son of, but he goes with somebody else from the same kingdom as him to stop that prince from being taken to his father to assume a role in the royalty of that country, because they want that country to fail because of what has been done to them. So they're following him, and those 3 are kind of like chasing each other around. And then we also have a princess of a different country, like a sister country to the one that the prince is from. I'm sorry that this is confusing. This is high fantasy for you. And then we have the soldier who is her personal guard, who she is in love with, and he's in love with her, but obviously they can't be together, and she is being married to the prince of a different country. But then we also follow the guard that like she's in love with as well. So this book, I would say, does nothing especially new for the like multi-perspective high fantasy genre. It is once again like a group of unlikely allies who end up coming together and finding out that their goals are pretty similar, and they all have a unique ability and all represent like a different faction of people, so that when they come together, their skills work really well together and they can help each other to achieve the same goal. You have betrayals along the way. Some of them really don't like each other, some of them are attracted to each other, and all of this causes conflict as they are not really achieving their mission in this one, because this is the first book in a trilogy. This one is really just about discovering how all of them are related and how everything ties back to demon smoke and what role that is going to play in the future of this series. I will say that while this does nothing really to move the genre forward, I really like multi-perspective high fantasy in this vein when it is done well. And a series that I can think of that I also really enjoyed, that I know a lot of people think is very middle of the road, is the 5 Broken Blades series by Mike Holland. That one's a little bit different because it is more of like a heist narrative, but it is once again a group of unlikely allies that come together with a similar goal. Some of them hate each other, some of them love each other, and we have all of these messy relationship dynamics going on while we have the hijinks of like the actual plot in the background. And it's a formula that I really love and something that I don't mind reading again and again, and I find a lot of enjoyment in it. This also was quite reminiscent to me of The Demon King by Cinder Williams-Shimer, which I also really enjoyed, and it's very much a series that I want to carry on with. I feel like both this and The Demon King, because I can't remember if The Demon King is in the current round of reread and resume that I'm working on, but I do feel like this is going to end up being a reread and resume series. It's something that I would want to, because it is a little bit fast paced, and because it's not especially unique, it's not one that's going to lodge itself in my brain very well, but I very much want to continue on with the series. If you guys don't know what reread and resume is, I made a video that is a list of 10 series where I really enjoyed book 1, but it's been a little while since I continued, and because I enjoyed book 1 so much, I want to reread it so I can move on and finish the series. I'm still working on the first one, so it's going to take me a while to get through that list. I'm excited to see what the next series is that I'm going to be reading going into next year if I finish off my current trilogy, which book 2 of that trilogy is going to be in this video later on. But I do feel like this is what I definitely want to continue on with at some point, but realistically I don't think it's going to be super soon, but I will get to it eventually, and I had a really good time with this one. Would recommend if you are also somebody who just really likes the formula of the multi-perspective high fantasy genre, especially in young adult. I feel like when I read it in the adult demographic, I want it to be doing a little bit more and be a little bit more complex. But when I read it in a young adult space, I'm actually a lot more happy with it being a little bit more of a fun time and not something super unique. The last book that I read for the last episode of Shelve It or Scrap It was Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young. This is one that I've been really saving for the autumn season because it's a book that I assumed was going to be very atmospheric with just like a sprinkle of magic. Like like a contemporary witchy kind of fantasy, and it definitely did not disappoint on that front. I would definitely recommend this alongside books by like Shea Earnshaw and Rachel Griffin. It takes place in the Pacific Northwest, which is the perfect backdrop for an autumnal fantasy. But this one, I will say, do not go into it expecting it to be either a romance or a fantasy, because at its core this is a mystery with a sprinkle of those other two genres. So this is following a girl who is from an island, and the island itself contains a lot of magic that is providing the main fantastical element that we have in this book. And some of the women of the island have the ability to harness this magic, and it's the kind of place where you can never really leave it because it stays in your blood and it stays with you. And our main character did always want to leave, and she wanted to leave with her childhood sweetheart August, but unfortunately I think when she was in her senior year of high school, or when she just graduated, her best friend died and her boyfriend August was blamed for it. So his mother took him away from this island because it's such a small community where everybody knows everyone, and he was obviously facing a lot of backlash for this even when he was cleared by the police. And our main character's dreams kind of died there, and she ended up staying on this island. Now 10 to 15 years has passed since that has happened, and August has made his way back to the island to fulfill his mother's dying wish to have her ashes buried with the rest of her family. And obviously a lot of people don't like that August has returned, and it really starts to stir up these old tensions. This actually reminded me of a very different book that I've read recently, which is The Dry by Jane Harper, which follows a detective who comes back to this small town in like the countryside of Australia to attend his best friend's funeral, but his best friend has been accused of killing his wife and his child and then killing himself. And even though he is not that type of detective, the friend's parents convince him to look into the death because they don't believe, even though times are hard, they don't believe that their son could ever actually do this. In The Dry, the main character, the detective, was also associated with the death of a girl that he was friends with like way back when he was a teenager, and I feel like Spells for Forgetting really mirrored that and the hostility that was faced by both of these characters returning to a small town where everybody knows everybody and everyone's memory is super long. They don't forget a thing that happened in their community, and we have this kind of like mob mentality that very easily rises. So I did enjoy this one. I gave it 3 stars. My favorite thing about this was Adrian Young's writing style and also the atmosphere. I was right that this was the perfect autumnal read, especially with this Pacific Northwest backdrop, and the writing style really led into this. However, with this at its core being a mystery, that is not really my favorite genre, and it is the same kind of issue that I did also have with The Dry. And I feel like the pacing of this book, with it being quite slow, needed a little bit more in the plot if this was going to be a mystery, because the fantastical element in here is super minor. It does play a little bit of a role in the plot, but I think if this wasn't a fantasy, there wasn't too much that would be different about it if there was no fantastical element. And romance wise, we do have our main character in August kind of hashing out what happened many years ago, their feelings for each other and all of that kind of stuff. But once again, this isn't written like a romance. While it has a romantic element, the romance is not the dominant feature, and so I felt like the plot did need a little bit more oomph to make this like a very solid mystery. So I did like it. I would read more from Adrian Young in this vein again. I've never been particularly interested in Adrian Young's other fantasy, you know, things like Fable, Sky in the Deep, that kind of book from her has never really appealed to me, but I do think these more atmospheric reads are things that I could really enjoy, and I definitely would read more from Adrian Young in the same vein. I then made a vlog where I read a bunch of November releases that had been sent to me by the publisher that I hadn't gotten around to yet, the first of which I was on the blog tour for, which is Blackthorn by JT Geissinger. Now, I did not know what I was getting myself into when I requested this book. I got this from Pam Macmillan, so thank you very much to Pam Macmillan and Book Break for sending this to me. All I read when I requested this is that it was a gothic romance, and I was like, you know what, sign me up. Let's try this out. I then found out that JT Geissinger is predominantly a contemporary romance author, more along like the Motorcycle Club mafia style side of things, and that her books can get pretty intense, but I was not deterred. I went into this with an open mind, and you know what, I really enjoyed this one. This does have content warnings at the beginning, so if you are thinking of picking this book up, then definitely check out those content warnings before you go ahead and dive into this, because for the longest time throughout wrote this book, I thought the content warnings were exaggerating a little bit because there's a lot in there. If you want a full list from my lips, then you can find that in the vlog that I posted. But the more that this book goes on, the more intense it gets, and that makes sense because of the plot of this one. But this was truly a wild ride, especially that second half was insane. But because I went into this with no expectations, I feel like it really worked out for me. So while this one has been described as a gothic romance, I will say that it does have a little bit of a slow burn. There's a little bit of the longing, the pining, and the yearning in there. But writing style wise and atmospherically, it is not as heavy on the atmosphere as I typically enjoy from a gothic novel. But aesthetically, I do feel like it really leans into the gothic vibes. This one is following a woman in her late 20s who is from this very small town in New England, I think, another very spooky atmospheric area of the US. And this town has two rival families. She is part of one of them, the Blackthorns, and the other family are the Crofts. So she goes home because her grandmother has died, but as they are doing like the viewings in preparation for the funeral, she finds out that her grandmother's body has gone missing from the funeral home. So she starts to investigate that, and she has to team up with the son of the rival family, the Crofts, Ronan, who is also the love of her life, like her teenage sweetheart. They were kind of hooking up back in the day without either of their families knowing, and they were never in like an official relationship, and there's a lot of unresolved feelings that have been going on since our main character left, and essentially she's come back and found out that this guy has been waiting for her there all along. And there is a spanner in the works as well, because this woman has a child of a convenient age, shall we say. So I really liked the relationship and the tension between the main character and the love interest. I do feel like realistically in this situation with the grandmother's body going missing, there would be more emphasis put on that and solving the mystery than this book details. Like, it is more focused on their relationship. She is looking into the grandmother thing a little bit, but she starts to get derailed because her mother died suspiciously like when she was a teenager, and her family always thought the Crofts were responsible, and now that her grandmother's body's gone missing, she also starts to believe that they had something to do with that as well, and she starts to look into that while trying to deny her attraction to like her first love. And she has two aunts who are very ethereal. They're given almost practical magic vibes, and I do feel like they would be more concerned with the missing grandmother's body than they are throughout the course of this book. That kind of makes this a little bit more unrealistic than it already is. Due to the nature of this story, which I'm not going to spoil for you guys at all, things do get a little bit crazy, and it seems to kind of accelerate quite quickly in its intensity. That does make sense if you power through, like, it does make sense in context of the plot, but like I said, do take those trigger warnings seriously. It's a wild ride in here for a little bit, but I did, like I said, really enjoy the core romance that we have going on. It does have a little bit of an ambiguous end, which isn't my favorite thing, but once again, given the nature of the story and the plot, I feel like it worked pretty well in this regard. JT Geissinger, as far as I'm aware, has only really written the contemporary romance outside of this, but if she were to write anything, because like Mafia, Motorcycle Club, that kind of romance story is not really my thing. It's not something I have an interest in, but if she wrote something once again along the lines of this, or if she did something more romantic-y focused, I would definitely be interested. I feel like I would like more from her in this vein than something more like high fantasy, because I do feel like it shows that she comes from a contemporary romance background, and even though this is fantastical, like the Blackthorns are witches and the Crofts are cursed, which you find out very early on in here, I do feel like it works because it's more of a suspense novel than it is a fantasy. The other book that I read for that vlog was Cry Voidbringer by Elaine Ho. This one is an arc that was sent to me by Solaris, so thank you very much to Solaris for that. This, very different vibes to this, very, very different vibes. I thought that this was a sci-fi going into it to start off with because it has an eclipse on the cover. That is literally, like, I saw that and I was like, cool, sci-fi. It's not sci-fi, it's dark fantasy, and what I mean by dark is that it is bleak. It's not dark in that this is dark, you know? This is like kind of taboo and spicy and wild and crazy. This is just depressing, if I'm being honest. And I don't think it's bad. I gave it 4 stars, but if you ask me if I enjoyed it, I mean, my answer is not really, because it was a terrible time from cover to cover. But this one is an imperialist fantasy, and we're following a few main characters, but the first one we're introduced to at the beginning of this book reminds me a lot of like Gideon from Gideon the Ninth and Kissin from Godkiller. Her character does change quite a bit throughout this, but I feel like in her origins she is comparable to those two. And she lives in this society where children children are taken from their communities, once again from their cultures. They're drafted into this army and they have to fight as faceless members of this army. So their identity is stripped from them, their names that they go by and the names of the weapon that they're most prolific with. So our main character is called Hammer. They're also like marked so that they can't run away. They're always like turned around and sent back, and they're taken from their communities in blood tithes. And we have a main character who has really fought back against this, but at the point where she is in her life, she's kind of given up. Like, she knows that she can never leave and she's just resigned to her fate. And she also, like, she does love a good old brawl. We are also following a child that Hammer finds, who is one of the godchildren of this world, and that means that they have been given one of the powers of the gods. They're kind of almost like a reincarnation of the gods, and in recent years the powers of the godchildren have waned. Like, one of them has a power that is something to do with butterflies, like they can manifest butterflies, which is absolutely useless in this endless war that this society is fighting against an empire that is threatening to overtake them. But our main character has a very strong death power, which obviously is something that this society is going to find very useful in helping them turn the tide of this war. So this child, before her powers develop, is given to Hammer to look after, and Hammer is just so inconvenienced by this. But over the course of the beginning of this book, they start to grow closer, and Hammer has decided that when this kid's powers turn out to be absolutely useless like the rest of the godchildren, she is going to protect her from the death that they normally serve to these useless children. However, obviously it ends up going in a very different direction, and Hammer's job of protecting this child, who is called Viridian, becomes a lot more difficult. And then the third character we're following, I think, yeah, she's called Nias, and she was one of the faceless. However, the original king has died and his daughter has now taken his throne. However, she is a hysterical mess. She is not equipped to rule. She's like overly emotional. She has a lot of trauma. She snaps like super easily, both in a volatile way and also an emotional way. But Nias has climbed up the rungs of this society and made a name for herself as a faceless, and she has now become the main advisor of this new queen and also her lover. And she is hoping to achieve freedom for the faceless by being close to this queen, being her advisor, and she's hoping that she can manipulate this queen to do the right thing, because the queen doesn't believe in the tyrannical reign of her father, but she is also a product of that tyrannical reign, and that plus her privilege really does show through in this novel. So this starts in a pretty bleak place. It does. Like, the kid, the Viridian, has been tortured. Big content warnings for child abuse in here, because even when she's not physically tortured, she is treated pretty badly. Like, emotionally, she's emotionally manipulated and abused, and she is kept like physically in not great conditions at points in this book. So, and it is pretty graphic, so content warnings for that. But we have Viridian, who's been tortured, and she's not somebody with a natural instinct to fight back. Like, she's somebody who is like a freeze person as opposed to like a fight or flight. We have Hammer, who has had pretty much all of her will and motivation beaten out of her at this point, and Nias is clinging onto this thread of hope that she can make a better society for herself and her people, while dealing with the almost childlike attitude and emotions of this fledgling queen. Everything in this book just gets progressively worse and worse and worse. And I've seen this on the actual cover of the book. It says Cry Voidbringer, a novel, which to me implies that it's a standalone. And actually, for the majority of this book, I thought we were just going to end on a point of doom and gloom, on a point of no return. Everything's just gone to shit. And honestly, if it would have ended that way, I would not have been surprised. At this point, I was emotionally prepared for it, because when I say this gets worse and worse and worse and worse, like, there is no upward tick. There's an upward tick maybe in the first like 100 pages of this, and then from this it just goes progressively down and down and down until all of these characters, every single one, hits rock bottom. So it's pretty grim to read, and I'm not joking when I said that this is bleak. But the last 15 pages make me think that there could be a sequel to this, because we have just like one note of hope. So I don't know what the future has in store for this series. I am not super enthusiastic about continuing on because of how depressing this is, and like I said, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad book. I just wasn't prepared for such a pessimistic story. And because with fantasy as well, the great thing about fantasy is that it kind of deals with topics that are super prevalent in our society or have been prevalent in history, but in a way that gives us hope. Like, we have people to root for fighting back against that oppression and against that tyranny, and this didn't do that. It just took us completely to rock bottom. This did remind me as well of The Unbroken by C.L. Clarke, in that we are following both the oppressed and the oppressor in here. Nias, of course, is one of the faceless faceless, so not necessarily the oppressor, but from her we see the first-hand account of the queen and like her behavior and how she is choosing to lead her kingdom while oppressing like all of the faceless or representing a kingdom that has oppressed them. And we do also have a sapphic relationship in here with a power imbalance, which reminds me a lot of that book, but I feel like this deals with those kind of topics in a much more realistic and not idealistic way, whereas the Unbroken by C.L. Clarke, I feel like we're supposed to root for this romance that just doesn't make any sense and wouldn't work, and that's pretty much what killed that book for me. This one I think is a more satisfying representation of those kind of power dynamics. And then the final book that I read is sadly our last 3-star. I wanted to enjoy this one a little bit more, and that is An Echo of Things to Come by James Islington. So we all know that The Will of the Many is one of my favorite books. It was my favorite book of last year, and I would love to reread that sometime soon because I have The Strength of the Few ready for my unboxing video, and I'm so excited to get to that one. But I am also currently reading through the Lycanius trilogy, as this is the first series that I picked for the reread and resume project. So book 1 was a reread for me, and upon reread I didn't end up enjoying it as much as I had the first time around because of this series comparison to Wheel of Time. So I mentioned this in the vlog where I read this. I do make reread and resume vlogs to hold me accountable to continuing on with these series. If The Will of the Many is Red Rising meets Brandon Sanderson, the Lycanius trilogy is Wheel of Time meets Brandon Sanderson, and I think that the Wheel of Time influence is really strong in this one. If you guys don't know what the Lycanius trilogy is about, it is set in this world where we had these godlike beings called Augurs who had the powers of mental manipulation, so they could predict the future, they had visions, they could read people's minds, they could influence people in some instances, and they had power over this world because they were infallible. However, one day their visions stopped coming into fruition, and instead of telling the general public about this, they essentially tightened their fist in fear of losing control, which ultimately resulted in them losing control and them being overthrown. So there are people in this world now called gifted who always existed, but they are people with a lesser manifestation of the Augur ability. They have the physical manifestation, which they can essentially like move things with their mind and that kind of thing and manipulate energy. And our main character Davian thinks that he is a gifted. The gifted are now kept in slavery so that they can't rise up like the Augurs did and take control, and they have to attend these academies where they become fully fledged gifted that can help with society, and if they're too weak, if they can't pass these trials, then their powers are stripped. And Davian is panicking because he cannot get his ability to manifest the way that it should, and right at the beginning of the first book he is approached by a man who gives him an artifact and tells him like, the reason why your abilities don't work is because you are actually an Augur, and I need an Augur to go to this barrier in the north, take this artifact with you, it will guide you there, and you need to repair that barrier because otherwise the monsters of the world that have been held back for thousands of years in this prison are going to break free. So Davian sets off on this quest with his best friend who volunteers to come along with him, and they meet some more people along the way. Meanwhile, one of his other friends is left behind and something terrible happens in this academy, and she is left dealing with that, and there's like a rebellion plotline that she gets involved in. So we have a lot going on here, and it is a multi-perspective high fantasy. There's a lot of complexity in here. It does mirror Wheel of Time in some places with the plot, but I also feel like the distance that is maintained between the characters and the reader is something else that reminds me a lot of Wheel of Time. And I did, when I made the last vlog for this, I realized that The Will of the Many is actually written in first person where this is in third, and I'm wondering if that is the reason why I don't feel as connected to this story as I did The Will of the Many. But I do feel like I'm lacking character investment. There is one character in here that I love and have loved since I first saw him in book 1, and his perspective throughout this one continue to be the most interesting. Some of the others, it reminds me a lot actually of like the Of Blood and Bone series. I find what they're doing interesting, but I'm not necessarily super connected to them as characters, which once again is maintaining that distance. And in case you haven't noticed in this video, emotional attachment is incredibly important to me. It's what makes a book resonate with me and makes it a favorite, and that I feel is something that is lacking with this. Now there are things that I really enjoy about it, as with everything I've read from James Islington. I love his complexity of plot, and that is where the comparison to Brandon Sanderson comes in. I think that he plots in a very similar way. I think that he lays down the groundwork of his plot in a similar way, and he brings the plot twist to fruition in a very dynamic way like Brandon Sanderson does. I just find these slower moments in here to be more reminiscent of Wheel of Time and the kind of pedanticness in some ways that I really don't like about the writing of Wheel of Time, as well as a lot lot of similarities in the story. If you've read the two, you will understand the comparisons. I don't want to go into it too much and spoil either series for you, but something that I do really love about James Islington that is consistent once again throughout the Lycanius trilogy and the Will of the Many is that man has dynamic epilogues. Like in a lot of books, by the time you get to the epilogue, the core events of the book are over. They've wound down and we're now just going to read this little snippet that's going to lead us into the next book, normally following some irrelevant like kind of side character who's doing something in the background. And normally when I am reading books that have some sort of action element, so predominantly things like fantasy, right? Normally you get to the end of the book, there's a big culmination, there's an uptick in the pace. I tend to retain the actions at the end of the book the least because of that uptick in pace. There are less natural stopping points and everything kind of like almost rolls into the next thing. So when I get to the next book, it's normally the very end of the book before that I have retained the least. But James Islington's epilogues, like the book always ends on this amazing, like shocking final note. Like I wouldn't call them cliffhangers exactly, but I would say that you get some sort of like plot reveal or something that just makes you eager to grab the next book and want to start to consume it. And what I really like about that is that I then remember the exact note that we left the book on. Like I could tell you, I'm not going to obviously, but I could tell you what happens in the last 10 pages of every James Islington book I've read because his epilogues are so dynamic. And I like that he leaves us on this moment that has me eager for more and really enthusiastic about picking up the next book in the series. So I gave this one like a 3.5. A lot that I enjoy about it, but it's not going to be one of my favorite fantasy series. But as I love The Will of the Many so much and I'm excited to go into The Strength of the Few, I don't mind finishing out this series so that I have a good like grounding knowledge of James Islington's work going into what he is intending to release in the future and finishing out the Hierarchy series. So these are all of the books that I read in November. I feel like we have a pretty good show. I've read a lot of fantasy obviously, which is a nice balance because in October I didn't read a single fantasy book, and I actually, considering all of these are fantasy in some way, I think we have a very good range of fantasy here. There are not a lot of books in this stack that are actually comparable while still being in the same genre, which I find really cool. But if you have read any of these, feel free to share your thoughts on these books down in my comments. Let me know what your favorite book that you read in November is. I haven't decided what my favorite is. It's probably either A Time of Blood because John Gwynne always delivers, or Blackthorn because I went into this with no expectations and it surprised me. So with that in mind, if you want to let me know that you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, leave me a crow or raven emoji, which I'm pretty sure there is going to be one. Fingers crossed. If not, just leave me a bird. A pigeon will do. In December, I am hoping to read significantly more than I have been doing. I am not going to make my Goodreads goal. My Goodreads goal for this year was 110 books. I always set it as one more book than I read the year previously, and having already read one book in December, I am on 89 books. So I'm hoping to read 12 books total for December. Keep your fingers crossed for me. I am currently in the process of doing a full week of sprints over on my Patreon, which I'm hoping is going to help me out with the reading mojo, and you still have a few days if you're watching this when it's posted to join that if you would like to. I'm done witchering now. The November wrap up is over, so please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you want to. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram, or my Patreon if you want to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you're go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.